Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Sandra Bell, and I work for SunGuard Availability Services. I think, if you don't mind, we'll wait for just a couple more minutes as the numbers are popping up, and then we'll kick off. I can see the counter in front of me going up at the moment. Gosh, with the numbers of tickers going up, I feel as if I'm on one of those terrible game shows. Please be assured I won't sing, don't worry. Okay, so I think the numbers are looking fairly static at the moment, so we might as well kick off. First of all, I'd like to start out by saying a very, very, very big thank you for the BCI for this opportunity, for this to be able to speak in the middle of Business Continuity Awareness Week. It's a subject obviously very close to the organisation I work for, but also a subject very close to my own heart. I haven't always been on the consulting side of the fence. I have spent many, many years on the operational side of the fence, and so knowing the need for decent business continuity, disaster recovery, and crisis management is something that I know only too well. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the things that resilience organizations do. I've called it Make Hay While the Sun Shines, because that's really because I'm looking at relationships, which is a facet of business continuity and resilience that is often a very costly, sometimes, afterthought. And so thought it's a very small subject, but it actually has significant effects, and so a lot of this comes from my own sort of bitter experience from the operational side. So really a little bit about me. So I'm Dr. Sandra Bell, and I'm the head of resilience consulting at SunGuard Availability Services Europe. Now, SunGuard Availability Services have got over 40 years providing business continuity and disaster recovery solutions worldwide. Now, I know that, and I know that for a fact because I have been a customer for quite a lot of those years, ranging from I've had call centres for workplace recovery type solutions. So I've been in organisations where I've had regulatory requirement to actually recover a call centre, and so therefore I've relied on workplace to make sure that happens so we don't get fined. And then I've also variously in different incarnations used IT disaster recovery, because I've been at those organisations where IT is absolutely fundamental to going on. To making the organisation work, and then I got the opportunity to join the organisation about 3 years ago, and as I say, and I look after that resilience consulting. So what my team does is provide the glue that holds the various products and services that SunGuard Availability Services offer together. So it sort of comes from, almost the historic stuff going back the 40 years, where it was very much bridging the gap between the information technologists and the business to ensure that that information technology met both the business continuity as well as the business as usual requirements. What they were finding was that quite frequently IT systems are designed with the business as usual in mind, and then all of a sudden realize that when you implement your business continuity plans, you change the processes and the critical processes you're putting in place. You put different emphasis on different things, and if you haven't thought about that in terms of your IT system, then you can end up not being supported, and the recovery can take an awful lot longer than you anticipate. So that first bit is about bridging that gap. The second bit of what my team have been doing is working with business operations to ensure that they've got the plans and capability in place to continue despite disruption. So that's your classic business continuity, making sure that the products and services can continually to be delivered despite there being disruptions in place. However, the bit that I'm going to be talking about a little bit today is one facet of the resilience space. So resilience has really been driven by sort of globalization and consumerism. Again, I'll come on to those a little bit later on. And so what I'm finding that I'm spending most of my time doing now is bridging the gap between the C-suite, so the executive of the organization, and the business, to ensure that any accepted risks can be managed in real time, and then more importantly, that the organization as a whole can thrive despite disruption. So that is as opposed to survive despite disruption, just simply striving for the status quo or aiming to just continue, as we'll see a little bit further on, can actually be a little bit of a recipe for disaster. So my first slide is all about resilience drivers. These are the sort of conventional things. So when we go around and we ask people, and I talk to my clients, and again from my own experience, what are the sorts of things that are driving resilience? Why would an organization want to be resilient now? We tend to find at the top of the list is a changing risk landscape. There's some good stats if you have a look at the World Economic Forum. You can track the global risk as they change over the past 15 or so years, and what you see is that both in terms of likelihood and also in terms of impact, the risk landscape is now characterized by complexity, uncertainty, and risks with adversaries. So I'll unpack that a little bit more. So the complexity is actually all about the world being interconnected. So that's very much about hyper-extended supply chains. It's sort of global sort of operations and all of that type of thing in there. So you've got a complex system as opposed to a complicated system. Now, the next one is actually about that uncertainty, and that's really all about those unintended consequences. A lot of that is because of the complexity of the systems that we're dealing with, but there are also some counterintuitive, what Rumsfeld would call the unknown unknowns popping in there, and then also the black swans, another phrase that we hear sort of bandied around in this sort of sphere. And the third one is those risks with adversaries. And I think the biggest one, the ones that catches the attention most frequently in our sphere, are the cyber attacks, where you've actually got somebody, a sentient being at the end of it. So when you're launching your response, somebody is there who will do something in response to your response and override it. And so therefore you need something slightly different in order to respond. But at the same time, what we've seen really starting from probably Henry Ford, really, with the rationalization of businesses, that the drive for economic efficiency has really pushed organizations to be a little bit more brittle than they used to be. A lot of that slack has been sort of driven out. with the lean management techniques and also with the core competencies and things like that. And then also we've seen really over the past 40 years accelerating in the past 20 with the internet is a massive information dependence. I remember the days when the computers, were the size of a small house, and we put a punch card in them, and then we drove them for transactions. So it really was the back office function, whether it be the finance or the HR or the payroll, was on transactional, and if it went down, you could pop it back up again. But now it's all about the interaction. It's how we do business, and then obviously e-commerce as well going in there. And then the third big one for me is the consumers. And again, we'll come on to it a little bit but they really do not expect heroes. People do not want to wait now in a globalized world to wait while we execute a heroic recovery. Put our pants outside our trousers and stay awake for 48 hours and while we recover from disruptions. They'll have gone somewhere else by the time that happens. And then what I found is that very much that all of those drivers are really exacerbated by those things that we see down the bottom of this slide in here. So the first one is conventional risk management. Again, a whole other webinar in terms of what I mean by this. But when you institutionalize risk management, you tend to find that it becomes very defensive. So if you think of risk in a purest sense, it's the chance that something will go take you away from your agreed path. It can be positive or negative. However, we generally think in an institutionalized setting that risk is a negative thing rather than the other side being the opportunity. So the conventional risk management techniques of avoid, transfer, mitigate, and accept will also generally reduce that opportunity. So if you put if you avoid the action that is going to cause the risk, then you've got no chance of actually getting the upside. Likewise, if you transfer the risk to a third party, you will only at best get a potential of the upside or the opportunity on there. And again, quite frequently, when you put mitigation controls in place, that also usually reduces the scale of the opportunity. So really, in a modern world, and certainly when you look at sport and all of those sorts of things, the general mantra is you have to accept risk if you want to win. And that really comes on to some of those other, the two dichotomies that I talk about here. The first one being the cyber risk dichotomy. On one hand, being connected to the whole wide world and the technology that provides you, access to your suppliers and your customers and all of that, actually provides you the tools for the growth. However, on the downside, it has allowed the democratization of the threat, which means that it is also potentially a negative risk factor to you. And then the final one, again, coming back to that economic efficiency, what I'm calling here a business risk dichotomy, that on one hand, you need to be efficient in order to maximize your profit, but in a dynamic and changing marketplace, you need to be flexible in order to remain competitive. And then right down there on the bottom right hand corner is the one that I'm really going to be focusing on today. That there is no such thing as an isolated incident. And I think when we've thought about this in conventional business continuity and in the past, there has very much been a drive for the rapid containment of the incident and so that nobody knows about it, and then an effective PR, defensive PR and communication strategy to maintain the brand. But maybe that is not the way we ought to be going in the modern world. So again, I'd like to make sure that we're all on the same track and really look at the, what is resilience in an organizational context. So what I mean by resilience is in an organization is that you are it is the ability to thrive under stress and uncertainty. And what I say, so you need resilience when you don't want to sacrifice that opportunity. As I said before, if you don't want to put those negative risk management things in there and you want to succeed, your environment is complex and interdependent, and that you have some unknown unknowns. So in terms, but in your thriving is going to be personal to you. So what you are trying to achieve will be the context for that thriving. So in an organization, you need three things. You need, on the right-hand side, that green box. You need an adaptive and fairly robust but change-ready organization. You need the effective networks and relationships to support you. And then you need leadership to go in there. So it's a little bit like, if it, the corollary, if you like, is in terms of the psychological resilience. So this is, the child getting into Oxford or Cambridge University despite coming from a deprived background. That's not getting into any old university. That's getting into the top. So that's the success as opposed to just survival. And what they need in terms of there is a strong will. What they need is a strong support network, and what they need is the ability to take their chances when they can. And the same is true of business. So for me, it's a combination of the skills, the will, and the grit to succeed regardless of what life throws at you. So you need an element of knowledge, which is all the sorts of things that we've been talking about in the business continuity disaster recovery world for many, many years. We need the elements of capability and tools, which is the sorts of things that the organization I work for, can provide. But you also need behaviors and cultures and the will to want to succeed. I often find when I'm talking to my clients, you can manage an emergency, but you need to lead a crisis. And it's that leadership quality, which is all about behaviors rather than a learned skill going in. But today, we're going to look at that sort of rather attractive teal blob on the left-hand side, which is those effective networks and relationships. And hopefully what we'll find at the end of it is that not just why they're important to us in terms of an organization, but actually why they are fundamental to the survival of the organization that we work in. So I'm going to bound the problem still further and just looked at those contracted relationships. So not at the stakeholders or friends or clients or customers, simply those things where we have contracts between. So if we look at this very, very simplified supply chain, I'm moving here from corn in the field to storage in some silos. I've then got a manufacturing thing where I'm turning something into bread. I've got some distribution. I've got a retailer. I maybe have some secondary manufacturing going on. Perhaps they turn them into sandwiches. And then over on the right-hand side, I have my consumer. Now, if we look at the arrows between each of these elements, there is a transaction that takes place across these. And when you look at those transactions, what you find is that each person at either side of that transaction is trying to do three things. The first thing they're trying to do is to protect their rights. So they're looking after number one. Secondly, they're trying to make money. And then thirdly, they're trying to minimize the risk to themselves. And all of those are very sort of hard output-based type tangible things you can get hold of and put numbers around. So if we then cast our simplified supply chain onto the world, it can look something like this. And this has been around this sort of thing that we're very, very used to, where something is, raw material in one side of the world transverses over to the other side of the world through its sort of supply chain going in here. And what you find there is that you've got that risk management and the risk minimization between each of the elements. And then you overlay on the top of that the various trade agreements that we have between countries. Brexit, anybody? And that actually then puts much more of that sort of risk coming in there. So then if we look at what we've done conventionally in our business continuity, well, the first thing that tells us to do is we probably ought to have a few more raw material suppliers just to max it, not put all our eggs in one basket. And then once we've done that, you generally find is that the bean counters in the organisation will go, wow, we've got more supply in there. That means we can produce more, which means they then put some more manufacturing and storage in order to be able to take advantage of that stuff that you've produced, which then allows you to have more profit, which means you can probably have different outlets. And then before you know it, you've got far more customers than you ever thought you probably had, which on one hand is great because that means you've got larger profit. But on the other side, that means that you're now beholden to a large amount of consumer power in there, and they can dictate what you're doing. But what you've actually done is, if we take away the pictures from this, is that you've actually created what our scientists and engineers will call a complex system of systems. And one of the characteristics of a complex system of system is that they self-heal. So if we have a disaster in one node of that, or one sort of network leg between the various things, that will be sensed by the rest of the system. But in our world, that will be potentially be seen on the news or on social media. So again, if you look at the latest statistics in terms of disasters befalling organisation, it takes less than 1 hour typically for it to hit the news that something's happening. Because the thing about complex systems is that they sense what's going on around them. And in terms of our organisation and our supply chains, we have an external sensing thing, which is all about the social media and the news and things like that sort of coming in. And what happens, the system will automatically change itself and reroute round the thing that is broken. Now that's great for the consumer. It's great for the other nodes in the system. However, it is potentially really bad for the disruptive node. Think about it, the equivalent of the lonely 10-year-old on the football sideline when the substitute was put on and the team found that he was much better at playing than him. It's much harder to regain your place in such circumstances. Or what about in a commercial sense? The greasy cafe that was on the A road, and then there was a road diversion that sent people down the motorway, and then everybody stopped at the service station and never went back to the greasy cafe. There are risks as well as advantages to having all of this complexity, especially in a world that will tell everybody when you've got a problem. And the brutal fact is, none of us is irreplaceable. And the other thing is that value add and why people will come back to you is not just because of the tangible thing that you bring to it. The lonely 10-year-old boy might be absolutely fantastic with his skills at the football, but unless he has those intangible relationships built up with the rest of the team that they value him more than the sum of what his skills are, then he's very unlikely to get his place back. So I think it's worth looking at your value chain. Is your value chain, or your suppliers, your upwards, downwards, sideways, horizontal suppliers, are they loosely associated? Do you only do what's in your contract? Do your suppliers only do what's in their contract? Do they work semi-autonomously? Is everything driven by quarterly meetings against metrics? And do those value measures, is the value only measured by the hard contribution in terms of pounds or dollars going into your business? Or alternatively, is it united and bound together? Do you help each other out? Do you collaborate with each other on things other than those things that have got hard contracts associated with them? When people look at your value chain from top to bottom, do they understand that the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? So if we go back, to this first one here, you will be safe in this sort of arrangement just as long as you provide hard value coming in to the organization and meet your service level agreements. But it's only when you are linked and tied through the intangible relationships that people will think about twice about dropping you like a stone when you get into trouble. So how do you solve this? Because obviously we have created, and there's a lot of culture around this, and as business continuity professionals, it's going to be really difficult for us to push against all of that. Well, I would say there are two areas, two things that you need to inject into those commercial relationships that you have with your supply chain. And the two things being flexibility and agility. And actually, they are fairly simple, if a little, you have to work at them, just like any relationship, to get them to work. So the first thing I would recommend is that you very much look at the types of contracts you have with your key suppliers and your key vendors. Are they arm's length? Are they adversarial? If they are, and you want to transition to this joint working, then really need to work on joint risk management. So you can start by potentially sharing your risk registers in the meetings where you normally go through the SLAs and you missed 4 minutes on this one and 2 hours over here and you were 5 hours late on this one, that sort of thing. Put a little bit of time aside to actually discuss what are the big things that you think might unhinge each other's companies. You will probably find that you have things in common, and you will probably find that if you work and put controls in together, you will become stronger as you would on any other personal relationship. So sort of things to look out for. Is everything in the contract driven by a service level agreement? Typically, we look a lot, as I say, because of the nature of our business, at the interface between the business and the business operations and the IT departments. And we very, very frequently find that the only interaction across that interface is that the business throws a couple of 3-letter abbreviations and some numbers over into the IT area. They are RTO 4 hours, RPO 0 hours. And that is the depth of the relationship in a lot of cases. So when you're having your adversarial service meetings, again, take time out to understand what is the impact of those numbers or missing those numbers, or what is the impact of being better than those numbers, and those barriers will start to come in. And then finally on this one, I would recommend Look at how do you gauge your suppliers. It was very trendy 10, 15 years ago to have supplier risk management. Lots of consultancies around the place who will come in and tell you how risky your suppliers are, which you can use to bash them over the head to get a better price. But that's the negative risk. What they don't do is look at what are the positive things they can bring. What is that flexibility? What is that added value? Again, I would look at that to start breaking those things down. And then to become more agile, it's really just as simple as becoming more aware. So don't just look at your risk, as I said before, but then you've shared them to get a flexible relationship. You now need to look at the whole enterprise, the whole value chain, and look at what could unhinge the whole thing. Because what you're doing by doing that is you're implicitly saying to everybody else in the organization that we are a unit together. And so you're actually working within it. And then also revisit and check what you are contributing to the larger things so that you can measure your risk and your standing within your and how sticky it is, and would they bypass you if you had an issue. Things you can do: communicate your risks and issues and near misses. Don't just rely on Twitter and the other social media or people down the pub going, hey, you never guess what happened in our data center yesterday. Actually do that openly, and your suppliers will thank you for that. Work on joint future products and ventures, because that signals to your suppliers and your other relationships that you're actually in it for the long run. You're not just in it for getting that short thing and the short-term gain, and so therefore you're invested in it in there. And then really the final one is really you need to elevate supplier and relationship management at the board level, because it's not just about cutting the best deal, getting the best profit, finding the cheapest supplier, etc., etc. In the complex system of system, this is a strategic existential issue, because if you haven't built the intangibles along with the tangibles in terms of that relationship, then you will be cut off and people will move around you, and they may not. You'll need to have a very compelling reason to come back to you in terms of that. So one of the things that we've done within our organization, and we work with lots of clients, is that we look at organizational resilience. You go, oh my word, where am I going to start? What do I need to do? Because it's so wide. It's skills, it's behaviors, it's products, all of that sort of stuff sort of going in. And what we really say is that you can start by looking at yourself, introspect, and I really mean introspect. I mean, it's not about what widgets I've got, what services. It's actually what is my culture, what are my behaviors, that sort of thing working in there. You can then lay those foundations, which is very much getting your hard things like your disaster recovery and things like that right. And again, coming back to making sure simple things like your IT was designed with business continuity and crisis management in mind, not just for today but also for the future. And then the thing that we, from business continuity professionals is all about, which is preparing the organization to be able to robustly defend its position if it needs to, but is able and agile to change on the fly if it needs to. Develop that crisis leadership. As I said before, you can manage and you can write plans for an emergency. But in a crisis, you need to make decisions, and so therefore you need leadership, and you can develop those skills in here. But what I've been talking about here is this bit. And all too often, and I know I've drawn it as the final step, but I really would push out to you all that even if you put all of the 4 in place, if you fall on that final step, all of the others just could very easily become very expensive investment exercises. And that is really all I have to say in terms of sort of formal presentation. So I'd like to sort of throw it open, if I may, to questions. I've got a little question. I can't hear any of you, if you might all be shouting at me in a moment. But if you would like to type them in, hopefully I will be able to pick them up and see them. I don't think I haven't got any typed in. Have you all got your gloves on? Okay. Well, as we haven't got anything sort of coming through at the moment, then I would like to say, again, a huge, great thank you, to the BCI for allowing us to provide, put this out there in terms of our thoughts. And also to all of you that have attended and listened, sort of to me through, this webinar. And if you've got any questions about any of our sort of 5 steps, and also, about the, that relationship building, again, I appreciate it's, it's a sort of soft type, sort of capability that you don't normally hear about from an organization, a hard IT organization, and especially from somebody like me, who's a physicist through and through. But believe me, without friends who can support you when you've got a disaster, and by friends I mean your supply chain, things can get very difficult indeed. Okay, thank you very much.